let's talk about the NL Central, Sean. This division, we talked about it off the air before we got started here as we were sitting in the lobby getting ready for the top of the hour here. And there's a lot of additions and subtractions. There's a lot of trades and a lot of quiet ones, if you will, inside this division. Every single team, I feel, has a storyline that can be very crucial this season. Maybe not as truly as a playoff contender, but moving forward into being a successful team in the future. And I gotta say that I think it starts with all the big additions that started with the Chicago Cubs. I really do think that there is just some really big moves that happened with Chicago. We have to talk about probably the biggest thing that happened in the division. Dansby Swanson comes over in the addition to the Chicago Cubs. That was a big contract. Every single shortstop really that was a big name that goes somewhere had a big contract this year. They go and take a risk on guys like Cody Bellinger. They take a risk on Jameson Taillon. They take another risk on Eric Hosmer. Yes, they did lose Wilson Contreras to St. Louis. However, there's some really fun things about this team. I know last year they were in a complete rebuild. A lot of people questioned why they didn't make the trades at the deadline. Well, they seem to be doing a lot of moves here in the winter, Sean.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting, and of course I have a little bit of a horse in that race with Marcus Stroman previously playing in Toronto, and so I want the Cubs to do well, and Taillon's an interesting addition for them. When you look at 4 years, $68 million, it's 1 year longer, and I think $7 million more than Chris Bassett got from the Blue Jays, right? And this is the kind of around that ballpark, that's kind of mid-tier starting pitchers. Taillon's an interesting guy, still able to pump it up to 94, mid-90s. He's what's interesting, though, last year was he had the second lowest walk rate at 4.4% of his entire career. Which is, obviously a great sign. You're heading into free agency. You want to put up, career high numbers. What is a little troubling, though, and I'll be paying attention when we're watching Taillon this summer, is that 90% contact rate in the zone. So, when you're throwing pitches in the zone and you're giving up that much contact, you're in for a rough season. And so the fact that he was able to keep his ERA under 4 last season was, I don't want to say miraculous, but it's certainly, kudos to him. And if he can maintain that in the NL Central, where the competition is a little bit different than say in the AL East when he was pitching for New York, I mean, maybe this could be a rather sneaky good signing for the Cubs.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because now we're starting to see free agent signings, and this is, I guess, the second year, if you will, of pitchers moving back and forth between the NL and the AL, and now they don't have to worry about if they're going to bat or not, right? With the universal DH, I always think that's just an interesting concept. I think there's a very underrated addition as well for the Cubs, Brad Boxberger. I really like this addition. He's caused some havoc at some points within that division. He used to be on the Brewers. Them coming over, I always love when a free agent signs to a different team within the division. It's like makes you think if there was maybe some possible bad blood between the old team and they just want to get back at that. Makes you wonder. We're going to talk about that obviously with Wilson Contreras going from red to blue. I mean, obviously one of the biggest rivalries in all of baseball. I'm really a big fan of what the Cubs have done so far this season. I know that there's a lot of what ifs, if you will, but what they were last year was not very good. And yes, they did have, I mean, let's be honest, they really weren't very good, but they do wind up keeping Happ. They do get rid of Contreras, even though they didn't really get anything for them like they thought they were going to at the deadline. But then you move into year 2 with a guy like Suzuki, who came over last year, was honestly a sensation. It was a breath of fresh air. What do you think year 2 looks like for him?
And actually, in all honesty, it could be even better. He's had a year under his belt to acclimate to, Major League Baseball, pitching, playing in the big leagues in the Major League Baseball over in North America. So I think that it will be interesting to see. Now he's projected to put up almost it's really interesting. He's projected to put up almost the exact same numbers across the board with a little bit more power. So 26 home runs next year is his projection right now, and a weighted run created plus of 128, which again is a bit of an uptick for him as well. So, often you hear about this kind of second year slump, the sophomore slump, and I'll be interested to see whether or not that actually applies to Suzuki, because by all accounts right now, he's actually projected to do a little bit better than he did in his first year, which is actually kind of exciting if you're a Cubs fan, right?
Yeah, it should be really exciting. I think this team
Yeah.
has a lot of big names that you can get excited about. And honestly, that's something they really need, especially after them kind of saying goodbye to the 2016 big players of Chris Bryant, Anthony Rizzo, Kyle Schwarber, right? They got to get a new band together, if you will. And Dansby Swanson can help lead that charge with Suzuki,
Mm-hmm.
with, guys like maybe Bellinger, if he steps up and finds a new place, finds a new home. I'm really rooting for Bellinger. I was really hoping that last year was his year. Now he gets a 1-year deal here. You're going to hear me say this a lot on the show. There's not a 1-year deal I don't like. And Cody Bellinger falls in that category 100% because he has every opportunity right now to prove that what happened in Los Angeles at the end of the season, the last of his contract, if you will, was just a bad slump, and he can find a way to potentially get back to his MVP form. Speaking of 1-year deals, it just happened today. Eric Hosmer does get a 1-year deal. Pretty interesting thing happening here. The Chicago Cubs will only pay the minimum, $720,000. I take that minimum. I don't know about you, Sean, but I would.
I mean,
this year to Eric Hosmer. He's not going to get paid $720,000, though. San Diego Padres are still on the hook for the remaining measly $38.3 million of the Eric Hosmer contract. If you're only going to pay just a pennies on the dollar, if you will, compared to this contract, might as well go for it. Eric Hosmer had a great first half of the season last year with San Diego before all the moves happened, the Juan Soto trade where he wound up going over to Boston to finish his season. He has the opportunities. I had him in fantasy last year in our over on Jace from the Couch Fantasy Baseball League, and he did really good for me at the beginning of the year. I wound up dropping him later on, but I paid attention to his stats pretty closely. If he can find a way to have his first half season, the risk taker with Bellinger and Hosmer, this team could be a sneaky pick for the NL Central.
Yeah, I think, and that's what, when I think of the Eric Hosmer deal, I think that one probably encapsulates the kind of the overall feeling about the Cubs offseason. And that's there's nothing super flashy about their offseason. There's nothing, the major headlines aren't in Chicago, but there's a lot of take a chance. And if all of these kind of dominoes fall and everything falls into place the way that they hope it does, you're absolutely right. This Cubs team could actually challenge for the division title, assuming things go right for them. And it's a great gamble and very little risk in the case of Eric Hosmer. You're paying league minimum. It doesn't really cost you anything. The only thing better than that would be a minor league deal. So for them, it's a great signing, because what have you got to lose? Right. And I think that's kind of where the Cubs are at this point. We're not going to be as bad as maybe Cincinnati, but maybe, if a few things go right for us, maybe we could be division champions, right? So I think that's kind of where they are. And I think the Eric Hosmer deal kind of is the best example of that.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And I'm not saying Eric Hosmer is going to be our MVP this season, but I do think that there is some opportunities for him to really make a big piece. I mean, he could be like what Anthony Rizzo at one point was for the Cubs. He could fill some of those voids. That would be the absolute ceiling. And I think Chicago fans would completely love if example came true. Last little part here before we move on from the Cubs. Now, they were really in a rebuild, if you will, after the whole 2016 team kind of moving on, the getting rid of Schwarber, Rizzo, Bryant, Baez. Do you think that what they done this offseason is enough for them to completely dig themselves out of this tunnel? Do you think that was enough to get out of the quote-unquote rebuild mode, if you will? Is that title now gone out of Wrigley Field? And do they have an opportunity to truly compete for the top of the NL Central?
Yes to the first part, no to the second. I think in all honesty, I think it is the beginning of the kind of the next phase of this return to competitiveness. They're starting to now make these bigger additions with Tyone and Swanson. So I think, yeah, it is the start, the rebuild. I don't want to say it's over. But I think it is kind of moving in the direction that fans would want it to, right? Because there's nothing worse for a fan, excuse me, than a rebuild, right? Like, so, is it enough though? I think a lot of things have to go in their way in order to compete with the Cardinals in that division. But that doesn't mean though that they can't potentially compete for a wild card, a la Orioles last year, the way they kind of nobody expected them to, but they still did, right? And I think that if the Cubs are going to compete, it'll be in that wild card race, which may even be more exciting than some of the divisional races we see in baseball.
Yeah, that extra one little spot in the wild card race
Mm-hmm.
could really mean a lot for a team like the Cubs.
Yeah.
I feel like that extra spot makes some of these teams that are on the bubble, the fringe, if you will, put a lot more effort into the offseason, a lot more effort into some of those trade deadlines. So I know that some people were a little upset about the playoff edition. I think it's making way more competitive baseball now that we're looking at bigger picture, truly.
Yeah, I agree. I think that what the Mets are doing, I kind of, is almost the opposite in the sense they're kind of like hurting that competitive nature because they don't care about money anymore. You know what I mean? So I think the extra playoff spot allows the teams like even the Pirates, you know what I mean, to have a little bit of hope and then go out and make some moves to try and, maybe for the Cubs, maybe this is the year where things just happen to work out. Having that extra playoff spot to compete for makes it much more worthwhile.